Hey, I'm bankruptcy attorney Matt McCune. Welcome to the Bankruptcy Show, the show your creditors really don't want you to watch or listen to. We're going to break down the facts about debt and bankruptcy, showing you what your legal rights really are and giving you the information that you need to take care of yourself and your family. Let's get into today's episode. Okay, let's get into episode 5. Just what the hell are exemptions? Generally speaking, when it comes to bankruptcy, exemptions are your friends. These are simply assets that you get to keep that do not get liquidated by the Chapter 7 trustee in a bankruptcy liquidation. So when you file bankruptcy, you create this nebulous concept referred to as a bankruptcy estate. And there's a lot of litigation over, what that means and what's included and what's not. Exemptions are property that are excluded from the bankruptcy estate. And practically speaking, what that means is I can go bankrupt, and if I have some property, if it's exempt, if it's an asset that's below the exemption level, well, then I can file Chapter 7 bankruptcy and not lose it to the Chapter 7 liquidation. So that's a good news. If I'm in a Chapter 13, if I have non-exempt assets, sometimes that means I have to pay more to my creditors. So exemptions are good, right? We want to interpret your exemptions to your benefit in a bankruptcy. I love to get philosophical about bankruptcy, and if you haven't watched episode 1, watch that, because that's kind of the big picture question about should people repay their debts, when is it justified for them to not have to do so, etc., etc. This is probably the next logical question in that sequence, is if I do have to go bankrupt, what do I get to keep, right? What assets do I have what am I allowed to move forward with? Bankruptcy, insolvency, this stuff goes back, to the beginning of time. So they talk about bankruptcy in the Bible. They refer to it as a jubilee. Every 7 years you would forgive your debtors all their debts or something. Jubilee is an interesting name because the bankruptcy software we use is actually called Jubilee. It's a clever name. The Romans had an insolvency system. There's this idea that, if you can borrow money, the second we created debt, the capacity to borrow against our future labor, well, we needed a bankruptcy system too, because not everyone's always going to get paid back. So bankruptcy is a super interesting conversation in the United States. In the 1800s, basically, we had, each state kind of had their own system. And it was mayhem. If you couldn't pay your bills, they called it a race to the courthouse. And really the first creditor to get the judgment and enforce the judgment to get your assets, well, that creditor, got something at least, and everyone else kind of got hosed. So 1898, the Nelson Act, I think is what they called it, was the first time that our federal government tried to kind of normalize and even out nationwide a bankruptcy system. American politics are interesting because, we're this consortium of states, really. So, the federal government comes and says, hey, we're going to create this insolvency system. We're going to allow people relief from their debts if they don't pay back. States couldn't really agree on, what that would look like. So, everything's a negotiation. So ultimately what happened in the United States is, as the bankruptcy system was getting in place and kind of formalized, a deal that allowed it to go forward was, we're going to let states choose their own exemptions. So bankruptcy is complex. It's federal law. It's our own court system. It's a branch of the federal district court, but it's this hybrid between state and federal law, because while you're in the federal bankruptcy court, each district, state court, each state that you live in, this one state might have several districts, but each state can choose to opt out of the federal exemptions and choose their own. And it's not, the federal exemptions are not the floor. It's not like, hey, this is the minimum that you have to offer in exemptions. It's just kind of the default. And states can have way more restrictive exemptions if they want to do that. And restrictive would mean that they're not going to protect a lot of property. A more liberal interpretation would be, We're going to protect a lot of property. Like Colorado has a pretty liberal homestead exemption. You can have up to 250,000 equity, 350 or over 60. So, but some states have unlimited, like Texas, Florida. Now, there's rules to this sort of stuff, and you have to be eligible. But there are a handful of states that there's no cap. You can go bankrupt in you can have a castle, and hypothetically that might be protected. So, again, this is why it's so very important that you get someone in your district, your state that understands this stuff very, very well, because it's complicated. So the U.S. bankruptcy code, starts in the late 1800s. It gets changed, codified to the more modern system in 1978, and then in 2005 was the big Bankruptcy Reform Act. So those are kind of the rules we operate under right now. Most important to understand when it comes to exemptions is the exemptions that you get will depend on your state of residency, where you're going to file bankruptcy. So like in Colorado, you're filing bankruptcy in the federal district court for the District of Colorado, but you're going to claim Colorado exemptions. Now, there's a lot of weird rules about this sort of stuff too. You can't be jumping around. If you've moved, what used to happen is, high-level CEO of some corporation would, steal from the coffer and run to Florida and buy a, $10,000 mansion or something like that, file bankruptcy and say, hey, sorry, I'm claiming my homestead exemption on my $10 million mansion or whatever the hell it was. Congress didn't like that. So in 2005, some rules got put in place that forum shopping or hopping is the term, and it's getting harder to just decide, hey, that state's got more liberal exemptions right before my bankruptcy. If I'm rich enough, I'm going to just move there and then go bankrupt. So when you go bankrupt, right, you create this estate, and you're kind of saying to the system, saying, hey, here's I got a bunch of debt, obviously I can't pay, and here's what I have. Right? And the goal would be to lose as little as possible and get through the bankruptcy system. So, philosophically, it's an interesting question to ask, like, how much should you get to keep, right? Not all countries, not all economies have an insolvency system. In some places, you go to jail, right? They have what are called debtors' prisons. If you can't pay your bills, you go to jail. Now the data would support the theory that those countries and economies are not terribly sophisticated or successful, because no one's ever, you're not going to take a chance. You're not going to borrow some money and do something, take a risk, start a business, borrow from your future earnings. Because you might go to jail. So now there are those that argue, particularly in the American criminal justice system, that we still do have debtors' prisons, because when poor people, can't pay their court fines, fees, that sort of stuff, sometimes they go to jail, and it's hard to argue against that. Conversation for another time. So the big picture idea really is, collectively as humans, going way back to Roman times, we have decided that if you're going to go into some sort of insolvency system, the bankruptcy system in America is what we call it, locally in this current time, you get to keep something, right? The joke I used to say, I still say it sometimes, you don't come out of the bankruptcy court stripped naked and they smack you in the ass and say, good luck, that fundamentally does not work for a society, right? It doesn't actually help that person move forward. It's just bad all around. And we're such a debt-based economy right now, and millions of people going bankrupt every year, that would be very, very unfortunate. So thankfully there are these things called exemptions, and those are the assets that you do get to keep and move forward with, and each state's going to have their own. For the most part, most states are going to have what's called a homestead exemption, which means equity in your house that you live in is protected up to a certain level. Well, okay, so how do you determine your equity becomes a logical question. So this is fairly simple, but let's go through it. So let's say I got a house, right, and I'm exploring my bankruptcy options. First thing I would do is I would go to Zillow. What does Zillow say my house is worth? And most of us know you pay attention to what your neighbors are selling your house for, that sort of stuff. Let's say my house is worth $500,000. I got a $500,000 home. All right, well, I don't have equity of $500,000 because more likely than not, I got a loan on that. I borrowed money. I got a mortgage. So you take the value of the asset, whether it's a house or a car, whatever, you subtract the lien, right? That's the debt. And that'd be your car loan or your mortgage, that sort of stuff. The difference is your equity, Now we can beat up with cost of sale, and we do these sort of things in the bankruptcy system. But generally speaking, you figure out what the damn thing's worth, you subtract what you owe on it. That's what your equity is. So if I got 300,000 owed on this mortgage of my house that's worth $500,000, I got $200,000 equity in my house. Guess what? In Colorado, I'm below the 250,000 homestead exemption. I can go bankrupt. I keep my house. Now you got to keep paying. Despite what many of my clients would like to think, there is no such thing as a free house in bankruptcy. You got to pay if you want to keep it, right? You got to keep paying that mortgage. The idea there is that there's two parts to a secured transaction, right? You've got the promise to pay. We'll call that the note, right? I promise to pay the mortgage company back $300,000. Well, they're not going to just take your word for it. They're going to record a security interest against that asset. That would be called a deed of trust, lien on a car, that sort of stuff. And the idea is if you don't pay, well, they can enforce their security interest against the asset. So if I got 200 grand equity in my house, well, I'm a fool to not pay it. Or if I can't pay it, to sell it, pocket the money. But if I didn't pay, technically the mortgage could come along, foreclose on that property, and they get that property back that way. So when you're figuring out, okay, what assets might I lose if I explored bankruptcy? Well, first and foremost, you're going to want to talk to a high quality bankruptcy attorney in your district that can help you find somebody. And then, figure out, okay, what equity do I have? And then what's allowed? And look, ChatGPT is a super helpful tool. Don't rely on it and file your case based on it. But when you're just doing some basic exploring, I would talk to it and say, here's the equity I have in my house. Do you think it's going to be protected if I went bankrupt? In Indiana, I don't know what the rules in Indiana are. You'd have to talk to someone there, that sort of thing. So that's the big picture idea, right? Shit happens. Right? We got so much debt out there. This is just the way the world works now. If I can't pay everyone back, I should get to hold on to some stuff. And for most of your basic clothing, your household goods, all your shit that isn't worth much, you wouldn't get $1,000 at a garage sale for all of it, is almost always going to be exempt. Your 401k, those ERISA qualified retirement accounts are almost always going to be exempt. If you got money in an IRA, that sort of stuff, typically it is, but that can change state by state. California's got some weird rules with that. You got to talk to someone in California about that. So, but the big picture assets that normal people have, retirement, home, cars, pretty much almost every state has some sort of protection for those assets up to certain levels. Now, what if I'm above, right? Let's say my house is worth $700,000, right? And I owe $300,000 on it. Well, I got $400 large equity in my home. If I'm going to explore bankruptcy options, I better be real careful about that. And I better be talking to a very high quality bankruptcy attorney, because if I file Chapter 7 in that scenario, that trustee's going to have a for sale sign in my front yard very, very quickly, because I have non-exempt equity. The bankruptcy estate has an interest in my house, and the bankruptcy trustee has a right to sell it. And the idea is, hey, you get something protected, but it's not unlimited. The judges love to say this: bankruptcy is a bargain, right? And yes, part of the bankruptcy system is designed to provide you, the debtor, with financial relief. Through the bankruptcy system, you get to wipe out some debt. But the other side of that, the flip side of that coin, is it's also designed to provide a fair payout to your creditors. Don't forget, you borrowed money from these people. And if you have assets above a certain level that the state says is the limit, if you're above that number, you got a problem. Okay, and you need to be very, very careful. And you should not be filing a Chapter 7 in that instance unless you're willing to just walk. And that happens sometimes too. So that is bankruptcy exemptions in a nutshell. The most important thing to understand is they are specific state by state by state. It's different everywhere. And you really, really got to get someone good local in your jurisdiction that knows these rules inside and out and can kind of spell out, well, this is what this looks like if you go this way. This is what this looks like if you go that way. Bankruptcy is pretty much about income, expenses, assets, and debts. And so the assets that you have are fundamentally extremely important to how your case might go. And the goal would be to not have any non-exempt assets that are subject to liquidation. But if you do, look, there's things that can be done, and you're going to need to get some guidance with that. Thanks. Have a great day. Talk to you next episode.